Elena Voss felt the eyes of the entire hall on her back, and she knew, without turning around, that most of those eyes wanted her to fail. The great doors of the Blackthorn Hall had just closed behind her, sealing her inside with hundreds of wolves who had never accepted a human-born woman as anything more than a servant. Tonight, she was supposed to become their queen. Her hands were shaking, but she kept them folded in front of her, pressing her fingers together so no one would see how badly they trembled. At the far end of the hall, standing on a raised platform lit by tall silver candles, was Cailan Ashgrove, the alpha king of the Blackthorn pack. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Tonight he wore a black coat trimmed with silver thread, and he stood so still that he looked more like a statue than a man about to be married. Elena walked toward him slowly, her long green dress brushing against the stone floor. She had grown up in a small human village far from wolf territory, and until 3 months ago, she had never even seen a wolf shifter with her own eyes. Then the elders came. They told her something she still struggled to believe, that she and Cailan shared a true bond, a rare and sacred connection that only appeared once in many generations. They said fate itself had chosen her. She had been afraid. She had also been hopeful, in a small, foolish corner of her heart, that maybe this strange twist of fate meant she would finally belong somewhere. As she reached the platform, Cailan extended his hand. His grip was firm but not unkind. "You look frightened," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "I am," she admitted. "You don't need to be," he said. "Whatever else happens tonight, you are safe with me." She wanted to believe him. The pack priestess, an elderly woman named Odetta, stepped forward with a silver blade and a shallow golden bowl. This was the binding ceremony, the ritual that would mark Elena as Cailan's mate before the entire pack. Elena had studied the ceremony for weeks, memorizing every step, because she refused to embarrass herself in front of people who already thought she didn't belong. Odetta lifted her hands and began the ancient words, calling on the moon and the old spirits of the Blackthorn line to witness the joining of two souls. The crowd grew silent. Even the youngest pups in the room seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Cailan took Elena's hand and turned it palm up. Odetta drew the blade lightly across his palm first, then across Elena's, just enough to draw a thin line. Their palms pressed together, and Elena felt a strange warmth spread up her arm. Like sunlight after a long winter, she gasped softly. "That is the bond forming," Odetta announced to the hall. "The true mark of fate." The pack erupted into a mixture of cheers and murmurs. Some wolves clapped out of respect for their king. Others whispered behind gloved hands, doubting that a human woman could possibly be the fated mate of their alpha. Elena tried to ignore them. She focused on the warmth in her palm, on the way Cailan's eyes had softened, just slightly, when their hands touched. After the ceremony, there was a feast. Long tables filled with food stretched across the hall, and musicians began to play. Elena sat beside Cailan at the head table, trying to remember the names of the pack elders as they were introduced to her one by one. There was Marin, a stern-faced woman with silver hair who served as Cailan's chief advisor. There was Corwin, the head of the pack's warriors, a broad-shouldered man who barely looked at Elena when he bowed. There was Odetta, the priestess, who gave Elena a strange, searching look before moving on to greet other guests. Elena noticed that look. She filed it away in her mind, the way she filed away every small detail that felt slightly out of place. Later that night, after the feast had ended and the hall had emptied, Cailan walked Elena to her new chambers. The halls of the Blackthorn Palace were built from dark stone, lit by torches that flickered against tall windows overlooking a moonlit forest. Elena had never lived anywhere so large or so cold. "You did well tonight," Cailan said as they walked. "Better than well." "I was terrified the whole time," Elena said. "You didn't look it." "I've had practice hiding fear," she said, before she could stop herself. Cailan glanced at her, curious, but he didn't press her to explain. They reached the door to her chambers, and he paused there, his hand resting lightly on the frame. "I know this isn't easy," he said. "Leaving your home, marrying a stranger, becoming queen of a pack that doesn't know what to make of you. Is that what the bond is supposed to fix?" Elena asked. "Make me one of you?" "The bond makes us equals," Cailan said. "Once it's complete, you'll be able to sense me the way I sense you. My feelings. My thoughts, sometimes. In fragments. It's rare, Elena. It's real. Once it's complete, Elena repeated. It isn't complete yet? Something flickered across Kaylin's face, so brief that Elena almost missed it. The first mark was tonight, he said. The second part of the ritual happens later, when both of us are ready. How much later? Soon, Kaylin said. And then, before she could ask anything else, he offered her a small, tired smile and said goodnight. Elena stood in the doorway of her new chambers for a long moment after he left, turning his words over in her mind. Soon. It was such a vague word. She told herself she was imagining things. That exhaustion from the long day was making her suspicious of nothing at all. She went inside, changed out of her wedding dress, and lay awake for hours, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window. The next morning, Elena woke to the sound of soft knocking. A young maid named Bridget entered, carrying a tray of tea and fresh bread. Bridget was one of the few pack members who had been kind to Elena since her arrival, and Elena had grown to look forward to their quiet mornings together. "Good morning, my lady," Bridget said, setting the tray down. "Did you sleep well?" "Not really," Elena admitted. "Too many new sounds, too many new thoughts." Bridget smiled sympathetically. "It gets easier, I promise." Elena sipped her tea, watching the steam curl upward. "Bridget, can I ask you something strange?" "Of course. Do you know much about the bonding ceremony, the full ritual, I mean, not just the part that happened last night?" Bridget's smile faded slightly. She glanced toward the door, as if checking that no one else was listening. "I don't know much," she said carefully. "Bonding ceremonies aren't something the staff are taught about. That's for the priestess and the pack elders." "But you've heard something," Elena pressed gently. Bridget hesitated. "I've heard that most matings only need one ceremony, the one you already had." She paused. "I don't know why yours would need a second part. I'm sorry, my lady. I really don't know more than that." Elena thanked her and let the subject drop, but the seed of doubt Bridget had planted refused to leave her mind. Over the following days, Elena tried to settle into her new life. She explored the palace grounds, always with a guard trailing a respectful distance behind her, per Kaylin's orders. She met more of the pack's inner circle, learned the rhythms of palace life, and slowly began to understand the delicate balance of power that held the Blackthorn pack together. Kaylin was kind to her, in his own quiet way. He asked about her day. He sent for extra blankets when he noticed she was cold. He seemed, in many small ways, to genuinely care. And yet, every time Elena brought up the bonding ritual, Kaylin changed the subject, or found an excuse, or simply said, "Soon again," in that same careful tone. A border dispute needed his attention. A trade agreement required his signature. He was tired from council meetings that stretched late into the night. There was always a reason, and each reason, on its own, sounded perfectly reasonable. But together, they began to form a pattern that Elena couldn't ignore. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after the wedding, Elena decided to visit the palace library. She told herself it was simple curiosity, a desire to learn more about the pack she now belonged to. In truth, she was looking for answers. The library was enormous, filled with shelves that stretched high into shadow, lit by scattered lanterns. Elena wandered the aisles, running her fingers along the spines of old leather books, searching for anything related to bonding rituals or pack traditions. It took her nearly an hour to find the section she wanted, tucked away in a quiet corner near the back. She pulled several books from the shelf and settled into a chair at a small reading table. Most of what she found was general history, stories of past alphas and their mates, records of pack laws and treaties. But one book, thinner and older than the rest, caught her attention. Its cover was worn, the title barely legible, Rites of the Moon, a study of sacred bonds. Elena opened it carefully. Inside were detailed descriptions of different types of bonding ceremonies, far more than she had realized existed. There was the standard mating bond, performed the way Odetta had performed it during her wedding. There was a deeper bond, described as requiring 2 separate rituals performed weeks apart, meant for couples whose connection was considered especially significant. Her breath caught. This matched what Kaylin had told her, about a first mark and a second part yet to come. Relief washed over her for a moment, until she kept reading. The book described the second ritual in detail, a private ceremony, performed only between the mated pair and the priestess, involving an exchange of memory and feeling meant to permanently link their minds. Without this second ritual, the bond would remain incomplete, a hollow shell that mimicked the outward signs of true mating without ever forming the actual connection. Elena's hands tightened around the book. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and Kalen had made no move to complete the second ritual. Every day he delayed felt less like exhaustion and more like avoidance. She turned the page, hoping for more information, but found instead a strange note written in the margin, in different ink from the rest of the text, as though someone had added it long after the book was first printed. The handwriting was elegant, precise. It read simply, "Beware the false mark. Not every bond that looks true is true." Elena stared at those words until they blurred together. A chill crept up her spine that had nothing to do with the cold library air. She closed the book slowly and sat in silence, listening to the quiet creak of the old building settling around her, and for the first time since her wedding night, Elena allowed herself to fully consider a possibility she had been pushing away. What if the bond wasn't real at all? She thought of the way Kalen changed the subject every time she asked about the second ceremony. She thought of Odetta's strange, searching look during the wedding feast. She thought of Bridget's careful hesitation when asked about the ritual, as if she knew something she wasn't allowed to say. Elena told herself she needed more than a mysterious note in an old book before she let herself spiral into suspicion. She needed facts. She needed proof, one way or another, and she realized, sitting there in the flickering lantern light, that she could not simply ask Kalen directly. If something truly was wrong, if he truly was hiding something from her, asking him outright would only give him the chance to explain it away again. She would have to be careful. She would have to watch and listen and learn the truth on her own terms. Footsteps echoed somewhere in the library, distant but growing closer. Elena quickly slid the old book back onto the shelf, tucking it exactly where she had found it, and gathered the other books into a neat pile, as if she had simply been reading pack history out of idle interest. By the time a figure rounded the corner of the aisle, she was sitting calmly, a history book open in her lap, her expression carefully composed. It was Marin, the pack's chief advisor, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with obvious surprise. "My lady," Marin said, inclining her head slightly, "I didn't expect to find you here so late." "I couldn't sleep," Elena said, keeping her voice light. "I thought I would learn more about my new home." Marin's gaze flicked briefly toward the shelf, where Elena had just returned the old book, and for a moment, something unreadable passed across her face. "A wise choice," she said finally. "There is much a new queen should understand about our traditions." "Is there?" Elena asked, watching Marin closely. "I confess, I still don't fully understand all of them." "In time, you will," Marin said, her tone smooth and unreadable. "Good night, my lady." She turned and left before Elena could ask anything further, her footsteps fading back into the shadows of the library. Elena sat alone for a long while after that, the silence pressing in around her, the words from the old book echoing in her mind. Not every bond that looks true is true. Elena looked down at the faint silver line still visible across her palm, the mark from her wedding night. It no longer felt like the beginning of a new life. It felt, suddenly, like the first thread of a mystery she was only beginning to unravel, and somewhere deep inside her, a quiet, steady voice told her that whatever the truth turned out to be, she would need to be strong enough to face it alone. Elena did not sleep that night. She lay in her large, cold bed, staring at the shadows the moonlight cast across the ceiling, and she made a decision. If Kalen would not give her the truth willingly, she would find it herself, piece by piece, no matter how long it took. The next few days, Elena changed her approach. Instead of asking Kalen direct questions about the bonding ritual, she began to watch him closely, the way a hunter watches a path before setting a trap. She noticed things she had missed before, small details that had slipped past her in the exhaustion of settling into a new life. She noticed that Kalen never touched the mark on his palm the way she touched hers, absent-minded fingers tracing the faint silver line whenever her thoughts wandered. She noticed that when pack members greeted her as the true mate, Kalen's jaw would tighten, just slightly, before he smiled and agreed. She noticed, too, that Odetta the priestess seemed to avoid being alone with her. Whenever Elena entered a room where Odetta was present, the older woman found a reason to leave shortly after. Always polite, always brief. It happened enough times that Elena began keeping a mental count. One morning, over breakfast, Elena tried a different tactic. "Kaylin," she said, keeping her voice casual, as she buttered a piece of bread. "I was thinking about the second ceremony again." Kaylin's shoulders tensed, almost imperceptibly. "Elena, I'm not asking you to rush it," she said quickly, before he could offer another excuse. "I only want to understand it better. What does it actually involve? Odetta hasn't explained much to me." Kaylin set down his cup. For a moment, Elena thought he might actually answer honestly. Instead he said, "It's a private matter between mates and the priestess. I promise you, when the time comes, you'll understand everything." "When the time comes," Elena repeated softly. "Soon," Kaylin said again, and Elena wondered how many more times she would hear that word before she stopped believing it meant anything at all. 3 days later, Elena found herself walking past the west wing of the palace, an area she rarely visited because it housed the council chambers, a section of the building reserved for Kaylin's advisors and closed to most of the household. She had gone there by accident, taking a wrong turn while trying a new path through the gardens, and she was about to turn back when she heard raised voices coming from behind a heavy wooden door, left slightly ajar. She recognized Marin's voice first, sharp and urgent. "The girl is not a fool, Kaylin. She has been asking questions. Sooner or later she will find someone willing to answer them honestly." "She will not find out anything before the treaty is signed," Kaylin's voice replied, low and controlled. "I have made certain of that." Elena froze in the corridor, her heart suddenly pounding so loudly she was certain the wolves inside the room would hear it. "And after the treaty is signed?" Marin pressed. "What then? You cannot keep a false mark hidden forever, Kaylin." Odetta grows uneasy performing a ceremony she knows is not what it appears to be. The longer this continues, the greater the risk that everything unravels, and not on our terms. Elena's breath caught in her throat. False mark. The exact words from the book in the library. She pressed herself closer to the wall beside the door, straining to hear every word, terrified of missing anything, and equally terrified of being discovered. "Once the Western Alliance is secured," Kaylin said, "her role in this will be finished. I will handle the rest myself." "Her role," Marin repeated, and there was something in her tone that Elena couldn't quite name, something close to disapproval, though whether it was disapproval of the plan itself, or of how Kaylin spoke of Elena, she couldn't tell. "You speak of her as though she is a piece on a board, Kaylin. She is a living, breathing person who believes she is your true mate. Have you considered what happens to her once her usefulness ends?" There was a long pause. When Kaylin finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "That is not your concern. It becomes my concern," Marin said, "when the entire pack's reputation rests on maintaining a lie that grows heavier by the day." Footsteps moved inside the room, drawing closer to the door. Elena's instincts took over before her mind fully caught up, and she slipped quickly and quietly back down the corridor, rounding a corner just as the door creaked open behind her. She pressed her back against a stone pillar, breathing hard, waiting until she heard the voices fade in the opposite direction before she allowed herself to move again. She walked back to her chambers in a daze, her mind spinning through everything she had just heard. False mark. Before the treaty is signed, her role in this will be finished. Each phrase felt like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of understanding through everything she thought she knew about her marriage. It was true then. Whatever bond she believed connected her to Kaylin Ashgrove was not real. It never had been. Elena reached her chambers and closed the door behind her, sliding down against it until she sat on the cold floor, her knees pulled to her chest. She thought of the wedding night, of Kaylin's hand pressed against hers, of the warmth she had felt spreading up her arm. Had that even been real, or had it simply been part of the performance, a trick of ritual magic meant to convince everyone, including her, that something sacred had happened between them? She thought of the weeks since then, the small kindnesses, the careful attention, the way Kaylin had asked about her day and noticed when she was cold. Had any of it meant anything at all, or had she simply been playing a role in someone else's plan? A piece moved carefully across a board, toward an outcome she knew nothing about. Elena did not cry. She was surprised by that, later, when she thought back on the moment. She had expected tears, expected the shattering grief of discovering that her marriage was built on nothing but calculation. Instead, what she felt was something colder and steadier, something that settled into her chest like a stone sinking to the bottom of a still lake. She needed more information. A treaty, a Western alliance, her role, whatever that meant, tied somehow to securing it. She thought of her own background, her ordinary human village, her parents who had died when she was young, the distant relatives who had barely noticed when the pack elders came to claim her for this marriage. What could a human woman, with no special title, no political power, and no wealth, possibly offer to a treaty between a wolf kingdom and some unknown Western alliance? She did not know the answer yet, but she intended to find it. Over the following week, Elena continued to play her part exactly as she had before. She smiled at pack gatherings. She sat beside Kalen during meals and asked polite questions about his day. She allowed herself to be introduced as the true mate to visiting dignitaries, biting back the bitter taste the words now left in her mouth. If Kalen noticed any change in her, he gave no sign of it, which told Elena that whatever connection they shared, it was shallow enough that he could not sense the storm building quietly beneath her calm exterior. That realization, more than anything else, confirmed what she already suspected. A true bond, the kind described in the old book, was supposed to let mates sense each other's emotions. If Kalen truly could not tell that something had shifted in her, that she now carried a secret weighing heavily on her chest every single day, then whatever connected them was nothing but an illusion. Elena began spending more time with Bridget, the young maid who had been kind to her since her arrival. She was careful never to ask direct questions that might put Bridget in a difficult position, but she found small ways to gather information, listening carefully to palace gossip, noting which visiting dignitaries came and went, paying close attention whenever anyone mentioned trade routes or borders or alliances. It was during one of these quiet mornings that Bridget, unprompted, mentioned something that made Elena's pulse quicken. "There's been talk among the staff," Bridget said, arranging fresh flowers in a vase near the window, "about visitors coming from the Western territories. Important ones, some kind of council delegation, arriving within the month." "Do you know why they're coming?" Elena asked, keeping her tone light. Bridget shrugged. "Something about a trade agreement, I think. The Kitchens have been told to prepare for a formal dinner in their honor. My lady, forgive me, but is everything all right? You've seemed distracted lately." Elena forced a small smile. "Just adjusting to palace life, I suppose. It's a lot to take in." Bridget nodded sympathetically and let the subject drop, but Elena's mind was already racing ahead. A delegation from the Western territories, arriving within the month. A treaty tied somehow to her presence in the palace. The pieces were beginning to form a shape, though the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. Elena decided she needed an ally, someone within the palace who might know more than the household staff, someone with access to records or history, that could help her understand exactly what role she was meant to play in whatever agreement Kalen was trying to secure. She thought of the palace historian, an elderly wolf named Iris, who maintained the pack's archives in a small study tucked away in the eastern tower. Elena had met her only once, briefly, during a tour of the palace shortly after her arrival, but she remembered Iris as sharp-eyed and quietly observant, the kind of person who noticed everything and said very little. The following afternoon, Elena made her way to the eastern tower, telling the guard who trailed behind her that she wished to learn more about pack history for her own education. It was, in a sense, entirely true. The historian's study was small and cluttered, shelves overflowing with scrolls and ledgers, a single narrow window letting in a thin stream of afternoon light. Iris looked up from her desk when Elena entered, her expression unreadable behind a pair of thin spectacles. "My lady," Iris said, setting down her pen. "This is an unexpected visit. I hope I'm not intruding," Elena said. "I wanted to learn more about the pack's history, and perhaps," she added carefully, watching Iris's reaction closely, "more about the Western territories, and what history exists between them and the Blackthorn pack." Something shifted in Iris's expression, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps caution. "That is a long and complicated history, my lady. May I ask what prompted your interest?" Elena chose her next words carefully. I've heard a delegation is arriving soon. I thought it would be wise to understand the relationship between our peoples before they arrive. Iris studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the distinct impression that the older woman understood far more than she was letting on. Finally, Iris rose from her desk and moved toward one of the shelves, running her fingers along a row of old ledgers until she found the one she wanted. There are things a new queen should know, Iris said quietly, pulling the ledger free and setting it on the desk between them. Not everything is written in books meant for public reading, my lady, but I will tell you what I can. Elena sat down across from her, her heart beating fast, sensing that she was finally about to learn something real. Iris opened the old ledger with careful hands, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. The Western Territories were once enemies of the Blackthorn Pack, she began. Generations ago, our ancestors fought over hunting grounds and border rights. The wars lasted decades, and both sides lost far more than either would admit. What ended it? Elena asked. A treaty, Iris said. A fragile peace, renewed every generation through careful diplomacy. But peace between wolves and the Western clans has always been difficult, because the Western Territories are not ruled by shifters alone. Their council includes human families as well, old bloodlines with influence stretching back centuries. Elena leaned forward. Human families? With power in a wolf alliance? Not power in the way you might think, Iris said. Influence. Trade routes, certain resources only they control. And, she paused, choosing her next words with visible care, certain bloodlines, carrying traits useful to shifters in ways ordinary humans do not. Elena's chest tightened. What kind of traits? Iris closed the ledger partway, as though hesitant to say more, then seemed to decide something, and continued anyway. There are human bloodlines, rare ones, that carry a natural resistance to a sickness that has plagued shifter packs for centuries, a wasting illness that strikes during long winters, weakening even the strongest wolves. It has no cure among our kind, but certain human bloodlines, when joined to a pack through mating or blood exchange, can pass a resistance to their children, and sometimes, through certain rituals, to the pack itself. Elena sat very still, a cold understanding beginning to creep through her. Are you telling me my bloodline carries this resistance? Iris met her eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. I do not know your bloodline's full history, my lady, but I know that the elders who selected you did not choose you at random. They searched for months before settling on your village, your family line specifically. I have seen the records myself, buried in the same archive where I found this ledger. Elena felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she remained perfectly still in her chair. Everything was beginning to make a terrible, clear sense. She had not been chosen because of fate, or destiny, or any true bond at all. She had been chosen because of blood, because of something in her lineage that made her useful, valuable, a resource to be secured, rather than a person to be loved. The delegation arriving from the Western Territories, Elena said slowly. They're part of this. Part of whatever treaty Kaelin is trying to secure. I believe so, Iris said carefully, though I do not know the full details. That knowledge belongs to the Alpha King and his closest advisors alone. And the false bond, Elena said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. The wedding ceremony. It wasn't real, was it? Not the way Kaelin told me it was. Iris did not answer immediately. She rose from her desk and moved toward the narrow window, looking out at the darkening sky beyond the tower. I have served this pack for a very long time, my lady, she said finally. I have seen kings rise and fall, treaties made and broken, alliances built on love and others built on necessity. I cannot tell you what is in the Alpha King's heart. I can only tell you what the old records suggest, and what my instincts tell me, and my instincts have rarely been wrong. What do your instincts tell you? Elena asked quietly. Iris turned back to face her. That you deserve the truth, whatever it costs to give it to you, and that the truth, in this case, is unlikely to be a kind one. Elena thanked Iris for her honesty, and left the tower as the sun began to set, walking slowly through the palace corridors, her mind heavy with everything she had just learned. She no longer needed to wonder whether the bond was false. She understood now, with painful clarity, exactly why it had been created in the first place. She was not a queen chosen by fate. She was a bloodline, a resource, a piece of a treaty being assembled to protect the pack from a sickness she had never even heard of until tonight. She thought of Kaelin's gentle voice during their wedding night, telling her she was safe with him. She thought of his hand resting against the doorframe of her chambers, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her. Had any of that been genuine, or had it simply been part of the performance required to keep her calm, compliant, and unaware of the truth until the treaty was safely signed? Elena reached her chambers and sat by the window for a long time that evening, watching the moon rise slowly over the dark forest beyond the palace walls. She thought of her parents, gone now for many years, and wondered what they would think if they could see her here, dressed in fine silk, called a queen by people who saw her only as a useful bloodline, wrapped in a convenient marriage. She made a decision that night, sitting alone in the moonlight. She would not confront Kaelin, not yet. If she accused him now, without proof beyond a note in an old book and fragments of an overheard conversation, he would deny everything, or worse, find some way to control the situation before she could learn anything more. She needed patience. She needed to gather every piece of the truth before she decided what to do with it. The following days blurred together as Elena settled into her new, quiet strategy. She continued playing the role of devoted mate during public gatherings, smiling at pack members, sitting beside Kaelin during meals, allowing herself to be paraded before visiting nobles as proof of the Alpha King's rare and fated bond. But privately, she watched everything with new eyes, cataloging every detail, every conversation, every small inconsistency that confirmed what she now knew to be true. She noticed that Odetta the priestess grew increasingly uneasy whenever Elena was nearby, as though guilt weighed heavily on the older woman's conscience. She noticed that Marin, despite her earlier warning to Kaelin about the risks of the deception, treated Elena with a strange, careful kindness that felt almost like an apology neither of them could speak aloud. She noticed, too, that Kaelin himself seemed to be struggling with something, some quiet tension behind his eyes that he tried and mostly failed to hide. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her conversation with Iris, Elena found Kaelin alone in his study, staring out the window at the darkening grounds below. She had come to bring him a message from one of the household staff, a small excuse to see him, though she told herself it was only coincidence. "You've been quiet lately," Kaelin said, without turning from the window. "I've had a lot to think about," Elena replied carefully. "About what?" Elena hesitated, weighing how much to reveal, how much to hold back. Finally, she said, "About what it means to belong somewhere. To a pack, to a person." Kaelin turned to face her then, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded flickered across his expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Do you feel as though you don't belong here?" "I feel," Elena said slowly, choosing her words with care, "as though there are things about my place here that I still don't fully understand." "Such as?" Elena studied his face, searching for any sign of the truth he continued to withhold. "The second ceremony," she said finally. "You still haven't given me a real answer about when it will happen, or why it keeps being delayed." Kaelin's jaw tightened, the same small tell Elena had noticed weeks ago. "There have been complications," he said. "Matters that require careful timing. I promise you, Elena, everything will be explained when the time is right." "When the time is right," Elena repeated, and she heard, this time, an edge in her own voice that she hadn't intended to let slip. Kaelin looked at her more closely then, as though sensing, finally, that something had shifted between them, though he could not name what it was. "Elena," he said, his voice softer now, "is something wrong?" She almost told him everything, right there in that quiet study, the weight of the secret pressing hard against her chest. She almost demanded the truth outright, consequences be damned. But something held her back, some instinct that told her the moment was not yet right, that she still needed more information before she confronted him with what she knew. "I'm only tired," she said instead. "It's been a long few weeks." Kaelin studied her for a long moment, as though he didn't quite believe her, but he let the matter drop. "Get some rest," he said gently. "We can talk more tomorrow, if you'd like." Elena nodded and left his study, closing the door quietly behind her. She stood in the corridor for a long moment, her heart heavy with everything she had chosen not to say, and somewhere deep inside her, she felt the last fragile threads of hope she had been holding on to since her wedding night begin, quietly and irreversibly, to unravel. She thought of the delegation arriving soon from the Western Territories, of the treaty that would decide her fate one way or another, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its certainty, that she had very little time left to learn the whole truth, before events beyond her control swept her forward into whatever future Kalen and his advisors had already planned for her. Whatever that future held, Elena resolved silently. Standing alone in the dark corridor, she would not face it as a fool. She would face it with her eyes fully open, and when the moment came for her to act, she would be ready. The delegation from the Western Territories arrived on a cold morning, 10 days after Elena's quiet conversation with Kalen in his study. She watched from a high window as a line of carriages rolled through the palace gates, flanked by guards in unfamiliar uniforms, gray and silver instead of the black and silver worn by Blackthorn soldiers. At the head of the procession rode a woman with pale hair pulled back in a severe braid, seated tall and composed atop a dark horse. "That's Councilwoman Vesper," Bridget said, standing beside Elena at the window, her voice hushed with something close to nervousness. "Head of the Western Trade Council. They say she's the one who actually holds the real power out there, more than any of the shifter lords." Elena watched the woman dismount with practiced grace, greeted immediately by Kalen himself, who had come down to the courtyard to receive her personally. Even from this distance, Elena could see the careful formality of the exchange, the deep bow Kalen offered, the measured nod Vesper returned. This was not a simple diplomatic visit. This was the beginning of whatever plan had been set into motion the moment Elena arrived at Blackthorn Palace months ago. That evening, a formal dinner was held in the Great Hall to welcome the delegation. Elena dressed carefully, choosing a deep blue gown that Bridget assured her looked every bit as regal as anything the Western nobles would wear. She sat beside Kalen at the head table, playing her part with practiced ease, smiling at the appropriate moments, offering polite conversation to the dignitaries seated nearby. But her attention remained fixed on Councilwoman Vesper, who watched Elena throughout the evening, with an intensity that felt less like curiosity, and more like evaluation, the way a merchant might examine goods before agreeing to a price. Partway through the meal, Vesper leaned toward Elena with a thin, polite smile. "I understand congratulations are in order. A true bond, I'm told. Rare, even among your kind." "So I'm told as well," Elena replied carefully, matching the woman's tone. Vesper's smile sharpened slightly. "And your family, my dear. Voss, is it? I don't believe I'm familiar with that lineage." "It's a small family," Elena said. "Nothing remarkable." "Everything is remarkable to those who understand its true value," Vesper said, and there was something knowing in the way she said it, something that made Elena's skin prickle with unease. Before Elena could respond, Vesper turned her attention back to Kalen, and the conversation moved on to matters of trade routes and border security, leaving Elena to sit quietly with the uncomfortable feeling that she had just been examined and found satisfactory, like a piece of merchandise passing inspection. After the dinner ended and the guests retired to their chambers, Elena could not sleep. She lay awake for hours, replaying Vesper's words, the strange emphasis on the word value, the pointed question about her family lineage. Everything Iris had told her weeks ago now felt undeniably confirmed. She was not here because of fate. She was here because of what ran in her blood, a resistance to some ancient sickness that made her useful to a treaty far larger than any bond of love or destiny. The next morning, Elena decided she could wait no longer. She needed absolute confirmation, not fragments overheard through doors or careful hints from a sympathetic historian. She needed the truth from someone who had been directly involved in creating the false bond itself, and there was only one person in the entire palace who fit that description: Odetta, the priestess who had performed the ceremony with her own hands. Elena found Odetta in the small temple attached to the western side of the palace, a quiet stone building filled with candles and the faint scent of dried herbs. The priestess was alone, tending to the altar, and she startled slightly when Elena entered. "My lady," Odetta said, straightening quickly, "I didn't expect you." "I need to speak with you," Elena said, closing the temple door behind her. "Alone. And honestly." Odetta's eyes flickered with something that looked like fear. "Of course, my lady. What troubles you?" Elena crossed the small room and stopped directly in front of the older woman, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I know about the false mark," she said quietly. I know the bond you performed at my wedding was not a true one. I know it exists to secure some kind of treaty with the Western Territories. What I don't know is everything else, and I think you're the only person willing to tell me." Odetta's face drained of color. For a long moment, she said nothing at all, and Elena wondered if the priestess would simply deny everything and send her away. But then Odetta's shoulders sagged, as though some invisible weight she had been carrying for months had finally become too heavy to bear alone. "I have prayed every night since your wedding, for the strength to tell you the truth myself," Odetta said quietly. "I did not have the courage." "I'm sorry, my lady. I am so deeply sorry." "Then tell me now," Elena said. "Please." Odetta sank onto a wooden bench near the altar, gesturing for Elena to sit beside her. "There is a ritual," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "far older than the one performed at true matings. It creates the outward appearance of a sacred bond, the mark, the warmth you felt when your hands touched, even certain signs that satisfy those who witness it. But it does not create the true connection. It is, in every way that matters, an illusion." "Why would anyone use such a ritual?" Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer. "For political marriages," Odetta said. "Alliances that require the appearance of fate and destiny to be accepted by the pack and by outside observers, when the truth is far more calculated than that. The Alpha King requested this ritual for your wedding, my lady. He came to me himself, months before you ever arrived at Blackthorn Palace, and asked that I perform the false bond in place of a true one." Elena felt something cold settle deep in her chest, even though she had already suspected this truth. Hearing it spoken aloud, confirmed by the very person who had performed the ceremony, made it undeniably, irreversibly real. "Why me?" Elena asked quietly. "Why did it have to be me specifically?" "Your bloodline," Odetta said. "The Voss family carries a rare trait, passed down through generations, that provides resistance to the wasting sickness that has plagued shifter packs for centuries. Through you, and through any children you might one day bear, that resistance could be introduced into the Blackthorn bloodline. But your family alone was not enough. The Western Territories, who share long history and trade ties with your lineage, needed to be brought into agreement as well, hence the treaty currently being negotiated with Councilwoman Vesper's delegation. So I am the treaty," Elena said softly. "Not a queen chosen by fate, a resource negotiated into an alliance." Odetta's eyes filled with something that looked like genuine grief. "I know these words offer little comfort, but I do not believe the Alpha King intended cruelty toward you, my lady. I believe he saw few other options to protect his people from a sickness that has claimed many lives over many generations. That does not excuse the lie. It does not excuse what he has taken from you these past months. But I do not believe his heart is entirely without feeling where you are concerned." "What happens to me?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Once the treaty is signed." Odetta hesitated, and that hesitation told Elena everything she needed to know before the priestess even spoke. "The false bond can be dissolved," Odetta said quietly. "Quietly, without public announcement, once its purpose has been served. You would likely be relocated somewhere discreet, provided for financially, but no longer bound to the pack or to the Alpha King." Elena sat very still, absorbing the full weight of everything Odetta had just confirmed. Every fear that had been building inside her for weeks was now undeniable fact. She had been chosen not out of love, not out of fate, but out of calculated necessity. And once that necessity had been fulfilled, she would be quietly discarded, sent away like a piece of business concluded, her usefulness spent. "Thank you," Elena said finally, rising from the bench, "for telling me the truth." "My lady," Odetta said, reaching out as though to stop her, "please, know that I never wish to see you hurt by any of this." "I believe you," Elena said, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. Odetta was not the architect of this deception. She was simply a woman who had been asked to perform a ritual and had lacked the courage to refuse or to confess sooner. Elena's anger, whatever form it would eventually take, belonged to someone else entirely. Elena left the temple and walked slowly through the palace gardens, letting the cold morning air clear her thoughts. She felt strangely calm now that the truth had finally been confirmed beyond any doubt. The uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks, the constant questioning, the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, she was wrong about all of it, had finally been replaced by absolute clarity. She knew now exactly what she was to Kaelin Ashgrove, a tool, a bloodline, a carefully selected piece in a political game far larger than any love story the Pack Elders had presented to her the day they came to her village. And she knew, with the same clarity, that she could not continue playing the role of devoted mate indefinitely, smiling through feasts and diplomatic dinners, while the people around her calculated exactly how much longer they needed to maintain the illusion before discarding her entirely. But Elena also understood something else, something that steadied her as she walked through the quiet gardens. She still had time. The treaty had not yet been signed. Whatever plans Kaelin and Councilwoman Vesper were finalizing, they were not yet complete. And in that remaining time, Elena intended to gather every piece of information she could, to understand exactly what leverage she might hold, and to decide, on her own terms, exactly how this story would end. She would not scream, she would not weep before the entire court, giving Kaelin and his advisors the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She would do something far more difficult, something that required more strength than any public confrontation ever could. She would wait, and watch, and plan, until the moment came when she could walk away entirely on her own terms, leaving behind nothing but silence and an absence that would speak louder than any accusation ever could. In the days that followed her conversation with Odetta, Elena became someone she barely recognized in the mirror each morning. Outwardly, nothing had changed. She still smiled at pack gatherings, still sat beside Kaelin during meals, still played the role of devoted mate, with a precision that would have impressed even the most skilled performer. But inwardly, she had become an observer, watching everything and everyone around her, with careful, calculating eyes, gathering information the way a soldier gathers supplies before a long and difficult journey. Councilwoman Vesper's delegation remained at the palace for several weeks, and Elena used every opportunity the extended visit provided to learn more about the treaty taking shape around her. She attended formal dinners and listened carefully to fragments of conversation about trade routes, border agreements, and something the Western nobles referred to only as the resistance clause, always spoken in careful, coded language that Elena now understood, referred directly to her own bloodline. She learned, through careful listening and the occasional well-placed question disguised as polite curiosity, that the treaty would formalize an exchange far larger than she had initially realized. The Western territories would grant the Blackthorn Pack access to certain medicinal herbs found only in their lands, herbs believed to slow the progression of the wasting sickness. In exchange, the Pack would formally introduce her bloodline's resistance into their lineage, a process that required not just her marriage to Kaelin, but eventually, children who would carry that resistance forward for generations. The thought of that future, children born into a marriage built on calculated deception, made something in Elena's chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. She had, somewhere in the quiet corners of her heart, allowed herself to imagine a real future here, despite everything she had learned. Discovering how thoroughly that future had been planned around her, without her knowledge or true consent, left her feeling more hollow than angry, at least for now. What made everything more complicated, more painful, in ways Elena struggled to fully understand, was that Kaelin's behavior toward her had not changed, even as her own understanding of their marriage transformed completely. If anything, he seemed to be growing more attentive, not less. He sought her out more frequently between diplomatic obligations, asking about her thoughts on the treaty negotiations, her impressions of Vesper and the Western delegation, her opinions on matters of pack governance that, weeks ago, he would never have thought to ask her about. One evening, after a particularly long dinner with the Western delegation, Kaelin found Elena on the palace balcony, looking out over the moonlit forest. He joined her quietly, leaning against the stone railing beside her. "You've been quiet tonight," he said. "There was a lot of talk about trade agreements," Elena said carefully. "I confess, some of it went over my head." "You handled yourself well," Kaelin said. "Vesper can be difficult. She tests people, looking for weaknesses she can exploit later. You didn't give her any." "Is that a compliment?" Elena asked, glancing at him. "It's an observation," Kaelin said, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're stronger than most people give you credit for, Elena. I've noticed that since the day you arrived." Elena studied his face in the moonlight, searching for some sign of calculation behind his words, some proof that this too was simply part of the performance required to keep her compliant until the treaty was finalized. But what she found instead was something that looked, disturbingly, like genuine sincerity. "Why did you really choose this ritual for our wedding?" Elena asked quietly, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Kalen went very still beside her. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and Elena wondered if he would simply deny understanding what she meant, continuing the same careful deception he had maintained for months. Instead, he turned to face her fully, his expression more open and unguarded than she had ever seen it. "You know," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet statement of fact. "I know," Elena confirmed, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "I know about the false bond. I know about my bloodline, and the treaty, and the resistance clause, and everything else you've kept from me since the day I arrived here." Kalen closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something in his expression had shifted, some careful mask finally beginning to slip. "I intended to tell you," he said quietly. "I told myself I would find the right moment, once the negotiations were further along, once I could explain everything properly. I see now how foolish that was. There was never going to be a right moment. There was only ever going to be more delay, more excuses, and I am ashamed of how long I allowed that to continue." "Why did you do it?" Elena asked. "Why not simply ask for my help honestly, instead of manufacturing an entire false bond to secure my cooperation?" "Because the elders believed," Kalen said slowly, "that you would refuse, if given the true choice. A human woman from a small village, asked to marry a stranger, and bear children for the sole purpose of introducing a bloodline trait into a pack she had never met. They believed the only way to secure your genuine willingness was to convince you, and everyone around you, that this was fate, not calculation. And you agreed with them," Elena said. "I did," Kalen admitted, his voice heavy with something that sounded, to Elena's surprise, like genuine regret. "I told myself it was necessary, that the survival of my pack depended on it, that the ends justified whatever deception was required to reach them. I did not fully understand, until these past weeks of watching you settle into this life, exactly how deeply that deception would come to weigh on me." Elena searched his face for any sign of dishonesty, any hint that this confession, too, was simply another calculated performance, meant to secure her continued cooperation, until the treaty was finalized. But what she saw instead was a man who looked, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely uncertain of himself, genuinely troubled by the weight of what he had done. "What happens now?" Elena asked quietly. "Once the treaty is signed, Odetta told me the false bond would be dissolved, that I would be relocated, provided for, but no longer bound to you or this pack." Something flickered across Kalen's face, something that looked almost like pain. "That was the plan," he said slowly. "The plan the elders and I agreed to, before you arrived here, before I actually came to know you." "And now?" Elena pressed. Kalen was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark forest beyond the balcony. "Now," he said finally, "I find myself far less certain of what I want than I was months ago." Elena did not know what to say to that. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to grasp onto this fragile, unexpected honesty as proof that something real might yet grow from the wreckage of a marriage built on lies. But a larger, more cautious part of her understood exactly how dangerous that hope could be. She had already been deceived once, thoroughly and deliberately, by a man who had looked her in the eyes and told her she was safe with him, while planning, all along, to discard her once her usefulness ended. "I need time," Elena said finally, stepping back from the railing. "Time to think about all of this. Time to decide what I want, now that I finally understand the truth." "That's fair," Kalen said quietly. "More than fair, given everything I've kept from you." Elena left him alone on the balcony that night, walking back to her chambers with her mind spinning through everything that had just been said. She wanted, desperately, to believe that Kalen's regret was genuine, that his growing affection for her over these past months was real, separate entirely from the calculated deception that had brought them together in the first place. But she also understood, with painful clarity, that belief and proof were two very different things, and she had already learned, through hard experience, exactly how costly it could be to mistake one for the other. That night, lying alone in her large, cold bed, Elena made a decision, that would guide everything she did in the weeks to come. She would continue watching, continue gathering information, continue playing whatever role circumstances required of her. But she would also begin, quietly and carefully, preparing an exit, a path forward that did not depend entirely on whether Kaylin's confessed feelings were genuine, or simply another layer of the same careful performance that had defined their entire marriage. Whatever happened between them, whatever the treaty eventually required, whatever choices Kaylin made in the days ahead, Elena intended to walk into her future with her eyes fully open, prepared for every possible outcome, trusting no one's word alone to determine what came next for her. She had learned that lesson at great cost. She did not intend to forget it. 3 days after her conversation with Kaylin on the balcony, Elena returned to the Eastern Tower to see Iris once more, this time with a clearer purpose than simple curiosity about Pack history. She found the historian exactly where she had left her weeks before, surrounded by scrolls and ledgers, the small study lit by the same thin stream of afternoon light. "My lady," Iris said, looking up from her work, "you have the look of someone who has learned more than she wanted to." "I have," Elena admitted, taking the seat across from Iris's cluttered desk. "Everything you told me weeks ago has been confirmed. The false bond, my bloodline, the treaty with the Western Territories." Iris set down her pen, giving Elena her full attention. "I am sorry it turned out to be true, my lady. Sometimes I wish my instincts were less reliable than they are." "I need your help," Elena said, deciding there was no benefit to hesitation now that the worst of the truth was already known. Not with more history, with something more practical. Iris's expression sharpened with careful attention. "What kind of help?" Elena took a breath, steadying herself, before speaking the words aloud for the first time. "If I decided to leave, once the treaty is signed, I would need to do so quietly, without drawing attention, until I was already well beyond the palace borders. I would need documents that would let me travel without questions. I would need to understand the safest routes away from Blackthorn territory, and I would need someone I trust to help me arrange all of this, without word reaching the Alpha King or his advisors." Iris studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You intend to leave, even if the Alpha King has offered you a genuine future here?" "I don't know what I intend yet," Elena admitted honestly, "but I refuse to be caught unprepared again, waiting for someone else to decide my future for me. Whatever happens between Kaylin and me, I want the ability to choose my own path, rather than simply accepting whatever role circumstances assign to me next." Something that looked like quiet respect passed across Iris's face. "That is a wise position, my lady, regardless of what you ultimately decide. As it happens, I may be able to help you more than you realize." Iris rose from her desk and moved to a locked drawer built into the base of one of the tall bookshelves, retrieving a small key from a chain hidden beneath her collar. Inside the drawer, Elena saw a collection of official-looking seals, stamps, and blank travel documents, the kind used by the palace to grant safe passage to messengers and trusted visitors moving through Blackthorn territory. "I have served this pack faithfully for many decades," Iris said, closing the drawer again after retrieving several blank documents. "But I have also watched too many good people used and discarded by those in power, treated as tools rather than as individuals with their own hopes and futures. I will help you, my lady, on one condition." "Name it," Elena said. "If you do decide to leave," Iris said, "you leave with a clear conscience, not out of spite or cruelty, but because it is genuinely what you believe is right for your own life. I will not help engineer an act of vengeance against the Alpha King, but I will help a woman reclaim her own choices, which is a very different thing entirely." Elena nodded, understanding and appreciating the distinction Iris was drawing. "That is exactly what I want," she said. "Not vengeance, just the freedom to choose, rather than being chosen for." Over the following weeks, Elena and Iris worked together quietly, meeting in the Eastern Tower under the guise of Elena's continued interest in pack history and record-keeping. Iris helped her understand the safest routes beyond Blackthorn territory, the locations of small human settlements where Elena could disappear without drawing suspicion, the documents she would need forged carefully enough to withstand scrutiny at any border checkpoint she might encounter. Meanwhile, life within the palace continued its careful, deceptive rhythm. The treaty negotiations progressed steadily, with Councilwoman Vesper's delegation making frequent visits to finalize the details of the agreement. Elena continued attending diplomatic dinners, continued playing her role as devoted mate, and continued watching Kaylin closely, trying to determine whether the vulnerability he had shown her on the balcony that night represented a genuine shift in their relationship, or simply another layer of careful performance, meant to keep her cooperative until the treaty's completion. To her genuine surprise, Kaylin's behavior in the weeks that followed suggested the former. He began spending more time with her outside of formal obligations, walking with her through the palace gardens in the early evenings, asking about her childhood in her small human village, sharing stories of his own difficult upbringing as the heir to a pack burdened with generations of political obligation. He seemed, in these quiet moments, less like the calculating alpha king who had orchestrated an elaborate deception to secure her cooperation, and more like a man genuinely searching for connection with someone he had wronged. Elena found herself torn between two competing instincts. Part of her, the part that had spent weeks gathering proof of Kaylin's deception, warned her to remain cautious, to view every gentle word and thoughtful gesture as a potential continuation of the same manipulation that had defined their marriage from the very beginning. But another part of her, quieter and more vulnerable, found herself genuinely moved by these small moments of honesty, wondering if perhaps something real might yet be salvaged from the wreckage of how their relationship had begun. One evening, walking through the gardens as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Kaylin stopped beside a small stone fountain and turned to face her directly. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you asked me weeks ago, about what happens once the treaty is signed." Elena's chest tightened, uncertain what she was about to hear. "And? I don't want the false bond dissolved," Kaylin said quietly. "I don't want you relocated, provided for from a distance, treated as a business arrangement concluded and set aside. I want to complete the true ritual, Elena, the real one. Not because the treaty requires it, but because I have come to genuinely care for you, more deeply than I ever expected to when this entire arrangement began." Elena stared at him, searching his face for any hint of calculation, any sign that this, too, might simply be another careful step in a plan she still didn't fully understand. But what she saw instead was a man who looked, for the first time since she had known him, entirely without his careful political mask, vulnerable in a way that felt almost startling, given everything she knew about him. "How can I trust that this is real?" Elena said slowly, "when everything about our marriage so far has been built on careful performance and deliberate deception?" "You can't," Kaylin admitted. "Not immediately. I understand that. I only ask that you allow me the chance to prove it, over time, rather than deciding my feelings are false simply because the beginning of our story was built on a lie." Elena did not answer immediately. She stood beside the fountain, listening to the soft sound of water trickling over stone, feeling the weight of an impossible decision settling over her. She thought of Iris's carefully prepared documents, hidden safely in the eastern tower, waiting for the moment she might need them. She thought of the treaty, drawing closer to its final signing with each passing week. She thought of everything she had learned about her own bloodline, about the calculated selection process that had brought her to this palace in the first place, treated not as a person with her own hopes and dreams, but as a valuable resource to be secured through careful deception. "I need to see it," Elena said finally. "Not promises, not words. I need to see, through your actions in the days ahead, whether what you're telling me is genuinely true." "That's fair," Kaylin said. "More than fair." Elena left him standing beside the fountain that evening, her mind more conflicted than it had been in weeks. She returned to her chambers and sat by the window for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky, turning over everything Kaylin had said, weighing it against everything she knew to be true about the calculated deception that had brought them together. She did not destroy the documents Iris had prepared for her. She did not abandon the careful plans she had spent weeks putting into place, but she also allowed herself, for the first time since discovering the truth about the false bond, to consider the possibility that her future might not require leaving at all, that perhaps something genuine could yet grow from soil poisoned by deception, if given enough time and enough proof to take root. Whatever happened in the weeks ahead, Elena resolved to remain exactly what she had become since learning the truth: watchful, careful, and entirely in control of her own choices, regardless of what anyone else, including Kaylin Ashgrove himself, ultimately decided about the future of their marriage. 2 weeks after Kaelin's confession beside the garden fountain, Elena learned something that changed the careful, fragile trust she had begun building with him. She learned it not from Kaelin himself, but from Maren, who summoned her to a private meeting in the palace's smaller council chamber, under the pretense of discussing formal etiquette for the upcoming treaty signing. "There is a matter I feel obligated to explain to you directly," Maren said, once the chamber door was closed and they were alone. "Something Kaelin may not have found the right moment to share." Elena's stomach tightened with familiar dread. "Go on." "Councilwoman Vesper has grown suspicious," Maren said carefully. "Not certain, but suspicious enough to raise concerns. She has requested, as a condition of finalizing the treaty, proof that the bond between you and Kaelin is genuine and complete. A public demonstration of the true ritual, performed before witnesses from both territories, to ensure the alliance rests on a foundation she considers legitimate." Elena felt the careful trust she had been building over the past 2 weeks begin to waver. "So the true ritual Kaelin offered me," she said slowly, "isn't entirely about what he wants. It's about what the treaty now requires." "I won't pretend the timing is a coincidence," Maren admitted. "Vesper's demand came before Kaelin spoke to you in the gardens. I believe his feelings for you are genuine, my lady. I have watched him closely these past months, and I do not believe the man who speaks to you now is performing the same careful role he maintained during your wedding. But I also cannot tell you with certainty whether his offer would have come as quickly, or at all, without Vesper's demand pressing the timeline." Elena sat with that uncertainty for a long moment, feeling the fragile foundation of trust she had allowed herself to build begin to crack under new pressure. "When is the ritual meant to take place?" 10 days from now," Maren said. "The same evening as the formal treaty signing. Vesper wants both events witnessed together, as proof that the alliance and the bond it depends upon are equally legitimate." Elena left the council chamber that afternoon, feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted once again, uncertain which direction was solid enough to trust. She thought of Kaelin's words beside the fountain, the vulnerability in his expression, the way he had asked for the chance to prove his feelings were genuine over time. 10 days was not time. 10 days was a deadline, imposed not by Kaelin's own heart, but by political necessity, and a suspicious councilwoman determined to protect her territory's interests. That evening, Elena confronted Kaelin directly, finding him alone in his study, reviewing treaty documents by candlelight. "Maren told me about Vesper's demand," Elena said, closing the door behind her. "The true ritual, performed publicly, 10 days from now. Were you going to tell me yourself? Or did you intend for me to learn about this, the way I've learned everything else in this palace, through someone else's careful whispers?" Kaelin set down his pen, his expression immediately apologetic. "I was going to tell you tonight," he said. "I only learned of Vesper's demand myself 3 days ago, and I have been trying to find the right way to explain it, without making you doubt everything I told you in the garden." "But it does make me doubt it," Elena said, her voice tighter than she intended. "How am I supposed to know whether your offer to complete the true bond came from genuine feeling, or from the same calculated necessity that created the false bond in the first place?" Kaelin rose from his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she could see the genuine distress in his expression. "Because my feelings existed before Vesper's demand," he said. "I spoke to you in the garden before I knew anything about her suspicion. I meant every word I said that evening, Elena, regardless of what political pressure now happens to align with what I already wanted." "How can you be certain of that?" Elena asked quietly, "when even you can't fully separate your own genuine feelings from the constant political calculations required to keep this pack alive?" Kaelin had no immediate answer for that, and his silence, rather than confirming her worst fears, seemed instead to confirm something more complicated and more human than she had expected. He was not lying to her. He genuinely did not know, with complete certainty, how to separate his own heart from the endless political obligations that had shaped every decision of his life since childhood. "I don't know how to prove something to you that even I struggle to fully understand myself," Kaelin said finally, his voice quiet and unusually honest. "All I can offer you is the truth of how I feel in this moment, standing here with you, separate from any treaty or any deadline Vesper has imposed. I care for you, Elena, genuinely, deeply, in ways I did not expect and did not plan for when this entire arrangement began. Whether that feeling would have found its way to you eventually, without Vesper's pressure forcing the timeline, I cannot prove to you. I can only ask you to trust it." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for the calculation she had learned, through painful experience, to watch for so carefully. She found, instead, only uncertainty, and something that looked remarkably like fear. The fear of a man who genuinely did not know if the person standing before him would choose to stay or to walk away entirely. "I need to think," Elena said finally, "about all of this. About what it means to build something real, within a system that keeps making demands of both of us, regardless of what either of us actually wants." Kaylin nodded slowly, accepting her need for space without argument. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I only hope, whatever you decide, that you'll remember I offered you the truth, even when it was difficult, even when the timing made it look like something calculated rather than genuine." Elena left his study that evening, with more questions than answers, but one thing had become increasingly clear to her as she walked back through the quiet palace corridors toward her chambers. Regardless of whether Kaylin's feelings were genuine, regardless of whether the timing of his offer had been shaped by Vesper's political pressure or by his own heart, Elena understood something important about herself that she had not fully recognized until this moment. She was tired of having her future decided by other people's timelines. She was tired of being asked to trust promises shaped by political necessity, tired of watching every gesture of affection filtered through the uncertainty of whether it existed for her sake or for the sake of some larger arrangement she had never chosen to be part of. Whatever Kaylin felt for her, whatever genuine connection might exist between them beneath all the calculation and deception, Elena realized she needed, more than anything else, to make her next decision entirely for herself, free from anyone else's deadline or demand. That night, Elena visited Iris in the Eastern Tower one final time before the treaty signing, and together, quietly and carefully, they finalized every detail of the plan they had been preparing for weeks. The forged documents were ready. The safest route beyond Blackthorn territory had been mapped and memorized. All that remained was Elena's final decision, one she intended to make not out of anger or fear, but with the same calm clarity that had guided her through every difficult truth she had uncovered since her wedding night. 10 days remained until the treaty signing, until the public ritual Vesper demanded as proof of a bond Elena still could not fully trust, and Elena intended to use every single one of those days deciding, with complete honesty toward herself, exactly what kind of future she wanted to walk into, and exactly who she wanted to become on the other side of whatever choice she finally made. The days that followed passed with a strange, quiet intensity, each one bringing Elena closer to a decision she felt forming inside her with growing certainty, even as she continued to weigh every possible outcome with careful deliberation. She spent her mornings walking through the palace gardens alone, thinking through everything that had happened since her wedding night, and her afternoons in the Eastern Tower with Iris, finalizing the last details of a plan she still had not fully committed to using. Kaylin gave her the space she had asked for, though Elena noticed the effort it clearly cost him. He no longer sought her out for quiet evening walks or private conversations, respecting the boundaries she had set, though she often caught him watching her across the dinner table, with an expression of careful, restrained hope that made her chest ache with a complicated mixture of tenderness and doubt. 5 days before the treaty signing, Elena received an unexpected visit from Councilwoman Vesper herself, who requested a private audience under the guise of discussing formal preparations for the public ritual. Elena agreed, curious despite her wariness, and found the Western Councilwoman waiting for her in one of the palace's smaller sitting rooms, seated with the same composed elegance she had displayed since her arrival. "I imagine you've heard of my request," Vesper said, once Elena had settled into the chair across from her. "The public demonstration of your bond, alongside the treaty signing." "I've heard," Elena said carefully, "though I confess, I don't fully understand why it matters so much to you personally." Vesper's expression remained carefully neutral, though something calculating flickered behind her pale eyes. "I have spent my entire career building agreements between peoples who do not naturally trust one another," she said. "I have watched treaties collapse, sometimes years after they were signed, because the foundation they were built upon turned out to be less solid than everyone believed. I do not intend to let that happen here, not when so much depends on this particular alliance succeeding. So the demonstration isn't about my happiness," Elena said quietly. "It's about your certainty." "Both, perhaps," Vesper said, with something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect in her tone. "I will admit, When I first arrived at this palace, I assumed your bond with the Alpha King was likely a political convenience, dressed in romantic language, the way such arrangements often are among ruling families. I have watched you closely these past weeks, my lady, and I confess, I am no longer entirely certain of that assumption. Elena said nothing, unwilling to reveal how closely Vesper's original assumption had matched the truth she had uncovered months ago. Whatever the truth of your feelings, Vesper continued, the treaty requires certainty, not ambiguity. My council will not accept an alliance built on uncertain foundations, regardless of how genuine the sentiment behind it might eventually become. I say this, not to pressure you, my lady, but simply so you understand exactly what is at stake in the days ahead. After Vesper left, Elena sat alone in the sitting room for a long time, turning the conversation over in her mind. Everything about her situation had become entangled in layers of calculation so thick that Elena wondered if it would ever be possible to separate genuine feeling from political necessity, not just for Kalen, but for herself as well. Did she genuinely care for him, or had months of careful performance simply worn down her defenses until she began mistaking familiarity for affection? She no longer trusted herself to answer that question with complete confidence, and that uncertainty, more than anything else, helped her understand exactly what she needed to do. She could not build a future, real or false, on a foundation this uncertain. She needed distance, clarity, and time, entirely free from the pressures of palace life, from Vesper's demands, and Kalen's hopeful glances, and the endless political calculations that shaped every single decision within these walls. She needed to discover who she was, and what she genuinely wanted, separate from the elaborate performance her entire life here had become. That evening, Elena made her final decision. She would not attend the public ritual. She would not stand before the Western delegation and the entire Blackthorn pack, participating in a ceremony meant to satisfy Vesper's political certainty, rather than any genuine truth about her own heart. She would leave before that moment arrived, quietly and without confrontation, giving herself the freedom to discover, far from this palace and its endless calculations, exactly what she wanted her life to become. She did not make this decision out of anger toward Kalen, though traces of that anger certainly remained, quietly simmering beneath the surface of her calm exterior. She made it, instead, out of a growing understanding that she could not fully trust her own feelings within a system designed so thoroughly around manipulation and careful performance. She needed to leave, not to punish anyone, but to finally give herself the chance to choose her own future, freely, and without external pressure of any kind. Elena spent her final days at Blackthorn Palace exactly as she had spent every day since learning the truth about the false bond, playing her role carefully, revealing nothing of her plans to anyone beyond Iris, who helped her finalize every last detail with quiet efficiency. She memorized the route Iris had mapped for her, a careful path through the forest that avoided the main roads and border checkpoints where guards might recognize her. She practiced, in her mind, exactly what she would say if stopped and questioned, though Iris assured her the forged documents would withstand all but the most thorough scrutiny. 2 nights before the treaty signing, Elena visited Bridget one final time, finding the young maid arranging fresh linens in the palace's laundry room. She said nothing of her plans, of course, unwilling to place any burden of knowledge on someone who had shown her nothing but genuine kindness since her arrival. Instead, she simply thanked Bridget for her friendship, for the quiet mornings they had shared over tea, for being one of the few people within these walls who had treated her, from the very beginning, as a person rather than a political arrangement. "You're speaking as though you're saying goodbye," Bridget said, studying Elena's face with sudden concern. "I suppose I am, in a way," Elena said carefully. "Everything is about to change, with the treaty signing so close. I wanted you to know how much your kindness has meant to me these past months." Bridget hugged her then, unexpectedly, and Elena allowed herself the brief comfort of that embrace, knowing it would likely be the last time she saw the young maid's warm, familiar smile. The night before the treaty signing, Elena found herself unable to sleep, lying awake in her large, cold bed, listening to the quiet sounds of the palace settling around her. Around midnight, she rose and dressed in simple, practical clothing that Iris had provided, nothing like the fine silks she had worn throughout her months as Kalen's queen. She packed a small bag with the forged documents, a modest amount of coin Iris had helped her gather discreetly over the past weeks, and a few personal items she could not bear to leave behind. Before she left her chambers, Elena sat down at the small writing desk near the window and composed a short note, choosing her words with the same careful deliberation she had applied to every decision since learning the truth about her false bond. She did not want to leave anger behind her, though she had every right to feel it. She wanted to leave something honest instead, a final piece of truth in a marriage that had begun with none at all. She sealed the note and left it on the pillow beside where Kalen would eventually wake, then walked quietly to where he slept in his own chambers, standing in the doorway for a long moment, watching him in the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. His face, unguarded in sleep, looked younger than it did during his waking hours, free from the weight of political calculation that shaped every expression he showed the world. Elena allowed herself one final silent moment, memorizing this image, before she turned away and walked quietly down the darkened corridor toward the palace's eastern exit, where Iris waited to guide her safely beyond the walls. She did not look back as she crossed the palace grounds under cover of darkness, moving carefully past the sleeping guards whose patrol patterns Iris had studied for weeks. She did not hesitate as she passed through the small side gate Iris had arranged to leave unlocked, or as she disappeared into the dark tree line beyond the palace walls, following the careful route that would lead her far from Blackthorn territory before dawn broke and her absence was discovered. Elena Voss walked into the darkness that night, carrying nothing but a small bag, a handful of forged documents, and a quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever came next, she would face it entirely on her own terms, for the first time since fate, or calculation, or whatever force had truly guided her path, first brought her to this palace many months ago. Kalen woke slowly, the pale gray light of early morning filtering through his chamber windows, and for a moment, everything felt ordinary. He stretched, glanced toward the window to judge the hour, and rose to prepare for what he knew would be one of the most important days of his reign, the formal signing of the treaty he had spent months carefully negotiating. It was only as he crossed toward his washroom that he noticed the folded piece of parchment resting on the pillow of the bed he had not shared with Elena, though he had grown accustomed, these past weeks, to finding small notes or messages from her, waiting in unexpected places throughout the palace. He picked it up, expecting perhaps a reminder about the day's schedule, or a small note of encouragement before the significant events ahead. Instead, he found something entirely different, and as he read the careful, measured handwriting, the ordinary morning around him seemed to collapse into something far more urgent and unsettling. The note was brief, written with the same calm precision Elena had shown throughout every difficult conversation they had shared, since she learned the truth about their marriage. You told me the bond made us equals, capable of understanding each other in ways no ordinary marriage could offer. I have spent these past months learning that equals do not require deception to secure each other's cooperation. I do not doubt that some part of what grew between us these past weeks was genuine, but I could not build my future on a foundation that required me to prove myself worthy of a truth you should have given me freely from the very beginning. I am not leaving out of anger, though I have every right to feel it. I am leaving because I finally understand that my future belongs to me, and only me, to decide. Please do not search for me. Whatever happens with the treaty, I wish your pack the survival it deserves. I only wish I had been asked, honestly, rather than chosen without my knowledge. Kalen read the note 3 times before the full weight of its meaning fully registered. Elena was gone, not somewhere within the palace, not delayed by some minor obligation he had simply forgotten, but genuinely, deliberately gone, hours before dawn, leaving behind nothing but this carefully composed farewell, and an absence that struck him with far more force than he had expected. He moved through the palace with barely contained urgency, first checking her chambers, finding them undisturbed except for the absence of a small bag of personal belongings and a set of simple traveling clothes that should have hung in her wardrobe. He questioned the palace guards stationed throughout the night, learning quickly that the eastern side gate had somehow been left unlocked, though no one could explain exactly how or when this had happened. By the time the sun had fully risen, word of Elena's disappearance had begun spreading quietly through the palace staff, though Kalen ordered immediate discretion, unwilling to let panic or gossip spread before he understood the full scope of what had happened. He summoned Marin to his study, the note still clutched tightly in his hand. "She's gone," he said, before Marin had even fully entered the room. Sometime during the night, she left this. Marin read the note carefully, her expression carefully neutral, though Kaelin thought he detected something that might have been quiet understanding beneath her composed exterior. I warned you, months ago, she said finally, that a lie this significant could not remain hidden forever, without consequence. I told her the truth, Kaelin said, frustration and fear tightening his voice. Weeks ago, I offered to complete the true bond, genuinely, not out of political necessity. And then Vesper's demand arrived, Marin said quietly, turning your genuine offer into something that looked, once again, like calculation rather than choice. I imagine that timing did more damage to her trust than either of us fully anticipated. Kaelin sank into the chair behind his desk, the weight of the morning's revelation settling over him with crushing force. The treaty signing is this evening, he said. Vesper expects a public demonstration of a bond that no longer exists, if it ever fully did in the way she requires. What will you tell her? Marin asked. Kaelin did not have an immediate answer. He sat in silence for a long moment, staring at Elena's careful handwriting, understanding, with painful clarity, exactly how thoroughly his own actions had shaped this outcome. He had lied to her from the very beginning, and even his eventual honesty had come wrapped in circumstances that made genuine trust nearly impossible to establish. Whatever feelings had grown between them these past months, real as they might have been built on ground too unstable to support the weight either of them had eventually placed upon it. Elsewhere, far beyond the palace walls, Elena moved steadily through the forest paths Iris had carefully mapped for her, using the cover of early morning mist to avoid detection as she made her way toward the small human settlement that would serve as her first destination beyond Blackthorn territory. She had walked through the night without rest, her legs aching, her mind still replaying every moment of her final walk through the palace corridors, the image of Kaelin sleeping peacefully, unaware that their marriage was ending in the quiet hours before dawn. She did not allow herself to look back, physically or emotionally, understanding that any hesitation now would only make the difficult choice she had made more painful than necessary. She had left honestly as circumstances allowed, explaining her reasons with the same careful truth she wished had defined their relationship from its very beginning. By midday, Elena reached the small settlement Iris had described, a quiet village far enough from Blackthorn territory that news of her disappearance would take considerable time to reach this far, if it reached here at all. She used the forged documents carefully, presenting herself simply as a traveler seeking temporary lodging, and found a small inn willing to accept her modest coin, without asking questions she was not prepared to answer. Back at Blackthorn Palace, the treaty signing proceeded that evening, under considerably more tension than anyone had anticipated. Kaelin stood before the assembled delegates from both territories, Councilwoman Vesper watching him with sharp, calculating eyes as he explained, as carefully and honestly as circumstances allowed, that his mate had been called away by an urgent personal matter, unable to attend the ceremony as originally planned. Vesper's expression revealed little, though Kaelin could sense, beneath her composed exterior, the sharp suspicion of someone who understood far more than her polite silence suggested. The treaty's terms required proof of a genuine, stable bond, she said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. I trust this unexpected absence does not indicate instability in that foundation. It does not, Kaelin said, choosing his words with the same careful precision Elena had used in her farewell note. It indicates, perhaps, that genuine bonds cannot always be timed to suit political convenience, regardless of how carefully we might wish otherwise. Something in his tone, some genuine weariness beneath the careful diplomatic language, seemed to satisfy Vesper more than any elaborate reassurance might have. She studied him for a long moment, before finally nodding, accepting his explanation, with visible reluctance rather than full conviction. The treaty was signed that evening, though with additional provisions Vesper insisted upon, safeguards meant to protect her territory's interests, should the bond prove less stable than originally promised. As the ceremony concluded, and the assembled delegates began filing out of the great hall, Kaelin remained standing at the head table, long after everyone else had gone, Elena's folded note still tucked carefully inside his coat, close against his chest. He thought of everything Marin had warned him about, months ago, when this entire deception had first begun. He thought of everything he had learned about Elena during their months together, her quiet strength, her careful intelligence, her unwavering determination to understand the truth, no matter how long it took, or how carefully it had been hidden from her. He thought, too, of her final words, the ones that lingered longest in his mind, as the great hall emptied around him into silence. My future belongs to me, and only me, to decide. Whatever came next, whatever path Kaelin chose to take in the months ahead, he understood, with painful clarity, that he had lost something far more valuable than any political alliance the treaty had secured, and that understanding settled over him with a weight far heavier than any crown he had ever worn. 6 months passed, and Elena Voss built a life for herself that looked nothing like the one she had left behind at Blackthorn Palace. She settled eventually in a coastal town far from wolf territory entirely, a bustling human settlement where no one knew her name or her history, where she was simply another newcomer seeking a fresh start among people too busy with their own lives to ask too many questions about hers. She found work first in a small bookshop, drawn to it by memories of the palace library, where she had first discovered the truth about her false bond. The shop's owner, an elderly woman named Constance, hired her within a week, impressed by Elena's careful attention to detail and her genuine love of books. Over the following months, Elena learned the rhythms of ordinary life in a way she had never experienced before, waking each morning to decisions that belonged entirely to her, choosing her own schedule, her own friendships, her own small pleasures, without any political calculation shaping the choices available to her. She thought of Kaelin often in those early months, more often than she expected or entirely wanted to admit. She wondered about the treaty, about whether it had held despite her absence, about whether Vesper's suspicions had ultimately caused problems for the pack she had left behind. She wondered, too, about Kaelin himself, whether his confessed feelings had been genuine, whether he had understood, in the end, exactly why she needed to leave, rather than simply trust promises built on ground too unstable to support them. She did not regret her choice, not once, even during the difficult early weeks of building an entirely new life from nothing. But she also did not pretend the choice had been easy, or that the ache of leaving behind whatever genuine connection might have existed between them had fully faded, even as the months passed, and her new life gradually became more familiar, and more genuinely her own. Iris wrote to her occasionally, using a careful system of coded messages they had arranged before Elena's departure, letters sent through a trusted intermediary that revealed just enough information to ease Elena's curiosity, without risking her safety or anonymity. Through these letters, Elena learned that the treaty had indeed held, that the additional safeguards Vesper had demanded had ultimately strengthened, rather than weakened, the alliance between the two territories. She learned, too, that Kaelin had never remarried, had never sought another bond, true or false, to replace the one Elena had walked away from that quiet night many months ago. She did not know what to make of that information, whether it represented genuine grief on Kaelin's part, or simply the practical difficulty of explaining to a suspicious Western council why their Alpha King's supposedly fated mate had vanished so suddenly. She told herself it did not matter, that her new life required no further connection to the palace or the people within it, but some quiet, persistent part of her continued to wonder, regardless of how firmly she tried to set the question aside. It was on a cool autumn evening, nearly 7 months after her departure from Blackthorn Palace, that Elena's carefully rebuilt life intersected once again with the past she had left behind. She was closing the bookshop for the evening, locking the front door, and preparing to walk home through the quiet coastal streets, when she noticed a familiar figure standing across the road, watching her with an expression she recognized immediately, despite the months that had passed since she last saw it. Kaelin looked different than she remembered, thinner, perhaps, and more tired, though his eyes held the same sharp intensity they always had, softened now by something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine relief at finally finding her after months of searching. Elena's heart pounded as she crossed the road toward him, though she kept her expression carefully composed, unwilling to reveal, too quickly, exactly how conflicted his sudden appearance made her feel. "How did you find me?" she asked, once she stood close enough to speak without raising her voice. "It took months," Kaelin admitted. "I promised, in a way, not to search for you, honoring what you asked in your note. But I could not fully keep that promise, Elena. Not entirely. I searched carefully, quietly, without disrupting the life you were building, until I finally found where you had settled." "Why come now, after all this time?" Elena asked. Kalen was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because I needed to know you were safe, he said. And because I needed to tell you something, I should have said the very first day I met you, before any of the deception, before the false bond, or the treaty, or any of the calculated arrangements that brought us together in the first place. What's that? Elena asked, her voice softer than she intended. I'm sorry, Kalen said simply. Not just for the false bond, though I am deeply sorry for that. I'm sorry for treating your future as something that belonged to me to decide, rather than something that belonged entirely to you. I understand now, more fully than I did even in our final conversations before you left, exactly how much that choice cost you, and exactly how much courage it took for you to walk away and build something genuinely your own. Elena studied his face carefully, searching, as she had so many times before, for any hint of the calculation that had defined so much of their relationship at its beginning. She found, instead, only quiet, genuine sincerity, the same vulnerability she had glimpsed beside the garden fountain many months ago, though tempered now by the weight of months spent alone, reflecting on everything that had gone wrong between them. I built a good life here, Elena said finally. Simple, but genuinely mine. I don't regret leaving, Kalen, even though I understand now that some part of what grew between us might have been real. I don't expect you to regret it, Kalen said quietly. I only wanted the chance to tell you the truth, freely and completely, without any treaty or deadline shaping the timing. Whatever you decide to do with that truth, whether it changes anything between us, or simply gives you closure you deserved, is entirely your choice. I promise you that. This time, without any hidden calculation behind it. Elena did not answer immediately. She stood in the quiet autumn evening, considering everything Kalen had said, weighing it against the genuine peace she had found in her new life, the careful independence she had built for herself over the past 7 months. She thought of the bookshop behind her, of Constance's kind patience as she learned the trade, of the small, comfortable rooms she rented above a bakery 2 streets away, of the quiet satisfaction of a life built entirely on her own choices. I need time, she said finally, echoing words she had spoken to him once before, in a different life, in a palace, far from this quiet coastal town, not to decide whether to return to Blackthorn Palace. I don't think I will, not as things once were. But time, perhaps, to understand what a genuine friendship between us might look like, separate entirely from thrones and treaties and false bonds. Kalen nodded, accepting this without argument, understanding, perhaps for the first time fully, that trust rebuilt after deep deception could not be rushed or demanded, only earned slowly, through patient honesty over time. I can accept that, he said. Whatever form our connection takes from here, I only want it to be something you choose freely, this time, rather than something decided for you. They spoke for a while longer that evening, standing together on the quiet street, as the autumn evening deepened around them, discussing small, ordinary things, the bookshop, the town, the Western Treaty that continued to hold steady despite everything that had happened. It was not a reconciliation, not exactly, but it was something honest, something built for the first time on genuine choice rather than calculated necessity, and Elena found, to her own quiet surprise, that this small, uncertain beginning felt more meaningful than any elaborate ceremony ever had. Kalen left the coastal town that night, promising to write, respecting the careful boundaries Elena had set, understanding that whatever future existed between them now depended entirely on her willingness to build it, one honest choice at a time. Elena walked home alone, through the quiet streets, past the bakery, up the narrow stairs to her small, comfortable rooms, and sat by her window for a long while, watching the stars appear over the dark water in the distance. She thought of everything that had happened since her wedding night, the careful investigation, the painful truths, the difficult choice to leave everything familiar behind, in search of a future that belonged entirely to her. She did not know, with certainty, what the months ahead would bring, whether her cautious friendship with Kalen would grow into something deeper, or whether it would remain simply a quiet, honest connection between 2 people who had once shared a complicated history built on deception. But she understood, sitting there in the quiet comfort of a life she had built entirely for herself, that whatever happened next, she would face it exactly as she had faced everything since discovering the truth about her false bond, with clear eyes, careful judgment, and an unshakable understanding that her future, now and always, belonged to her alone to decide. Outside her window, the stars continued their slow, steady path across the night sky, indifferent to treaties and thrones and false bonds. And Elena Voss, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt genuinely and completely at peace with exactly who she had become.